الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلاة الله تعالى وسلامه على حبيبه ومصطفاه محمد صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سلام الله عليكم ورحمته وبركاته من مسجد الأمة بهاليفاكس. هذه هي الحلقة الرابعة في برنامج الأسرة في الإسلام. This is the fourth segment of the series on Muslim family in Islam, conceptual foundation, fiqh or jurisprudence, and contemporary issues. In the previous segment, we spoke about the major objectives behind Sharia in Islam, or maqasid, the supreme objectives. And today, inshallah, we'll begin with the formation of the family in Islam. We begin first by the criteria for choice of spouse. And I say spouse because that applies actually to male and female, regardless of the form of address, because it applies to both. The Prophet ﷺ teaches us that a woman is sought in marriage for four things: for her wealth, for the nobility of her family, for her beauty, or for her religiosity. And then the Prophet ﷺ ends by saying, you win. In other words, the great prize really is to marry a woman who is religious in the proper sense. In fact, this hadith, by the way, is a sound hadith. In praising the women of Quraysh, the Prophet ﷺ said that the best of women are the women of Quraysh in his time, the women who rode camels. Salihu Nisa'in Quraysh, the most pious or best of the women of Quraysh, those who rode camels. And then he says they are most kind to their children in their young age, and the most observant and caring for their husbands. Now, a side remark here. For many years, I would say for a couple of decades or more, when some brothers or sisters ask me about whether a woman in Islam is allowed to drive a car, I used to refer to this hadith, that one of the praises of the Prophet ﷺ of the women of Quraysh who rode camels, drove camels. Subhanallah. It is a positive sanction of driving, as they didn't have the Cadillacs and Lamborghinis and whatever at that time. Their main ride really was camels. Of course, the camels varied in their value. The red camels perhaps would be very expensive and might be the equivalent of Mercedes or all that stuff that I can't spell, even Lamborghini, very expensive ones, all the way to a simple camel that might be somewhat similar to Toyotas or something of that nature. I say it lightly, but in fact I mean it. That there is no evidence that I know of in the Quran about women being barred from driving a car under all conditions. Nor do I know of any hadith that bars women. In fact, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ implies the ability to drive. But unfortunately, sometimes some or certain cultural practices in given societies, based on their own particular culture and concerns, may have this kind of practice, which of course, as we all know, this has been removed more recently in one particular country. It is not really a kind of kindness on the part of rulers or administrators. It is a right in the Quran and Sunnah. Anything mundane aspect in Islam that is not explicitly forbidden or forbidden on a basis of strong analogy to something that is forbidden cannot be restricted. So people mix between cultural practices, even though some of those practices are grounded in some religious argument, but not really evidence in the main sources of Islam. It is not obligatory on anyone to follow. It's an issue that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not forbid. In any case, there are more ahadith also along the same line when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but this hadith, I must say honestly, it's a da'if, weak, but not fabricated, and its meaning actually is correct because of other ahadith that are stronger, that anyone who marries a woman just out of her wealth, because of her wealth, Allah will only increase him in poverty. And anyone who marries a woman simply to raise his status because of the nobility of her family, Allah will keep him humiliation. And anyone who marries a woman so that he can guard his eyes, meaning from passionate look at women, to lower his gaze and safeguard his chastity, or to strengthen his relationship with his relatives, Allah will give him blessing in that marriage for him and for her. So it is quite obvious then the question or list of priority of the choice. How about women? Again, as indicated in several occasions in other programs, when the Quran speaks, for example, as if it addresses males, it also is an address to females unless there is an explicit evidence of addressing one gender or the other. But even here in the matter of women, not only that this criteria would apply to her in the choice of her future husband, but we find that also in hadith in Ibn Hibban, it was narrated that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Man zawwaja karimatahu min fasiqin faqad qati'a rahimaha." That anyone who gives his daughter to someone who's not good, he is actually contributing to severing her from her relations. Al-Hasan radiallahu anh, the grandson of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was once asked by a person. He said, "I have a daughter. To whom should I give in marriage?" Of course, with her approval, as we'll see again the condition. To whom should I give her in marriage? Al-Hasan radiallahu anh, he said, "You give her in marriage to one who fears Allah, who is conscious of Allah. If he loved her, or if he loves her, he will be really generous with her. He will honor her. But if he didn't like her, at least, even if he didn't like her, he will not oppress her or be unfair in his treatment of her." Finally, I'd like to add something that applies to both seeking a husband or wife. The Prophet ﷺ, as narrated in Ibn Majah and At-Tirmidhi, and that's a Hasan, strong hadith, إذا خطب إليكم من ترضون دينه وخلقه فزوجوه إلا تفعلوا تكن فتنة في الأرض وفساد عريض. The address here apparently is to the parents. It says, if anyone comes to you seeking the hand of your daughter, give your daughter in marriage to him if indeed you're satisfied with his religiosity and his character. Because if you don't do, there will be a great deal of commotion and corruption on earth. However, the hadith also, and all of the hadiths that we speak about in terms of criteria for choice of either spouses, do not preclude the notion that compatibility also is irrelevant. It just tries to strike at the heart of not giving one in marriage because he's not from the same race or same color or wealth or whatever. But it doesn't mean that compatibility also in terms of character, in terms of likes and dislikes, are relevant also for lasting marriage. In fact, we find a reference to that in the hadith narrated by Aisha radiallahu anha. That's again narrated in Ibn Majah and Al-Hakim and Bayhaqi. It says the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, تخيروا لنطفكم وأنكحوا الأكفاء وأنكحوا إليهم. Basically, the meaning of the hadith in a simple translation, he says, make sure when you get married or when you give your children in marriage, like your daughters to marriage, because this is a choice for the future generation, not for actually, I mean literally, what makes the human. It's a sort of metaphor of the character and the strength physically also of your future children or grandchildren. Now, as in the Mithaq al-Usra fil Islam, the very important contemporary reference on family in Islam, the scholars comment on this, that this includes also not just likes and dislikes of people who are compatible in terms of their level, approximate level of education or whatever, but they say it is also desirable to have a medical examination before getting married. It's good, especially if there is a possibility of a contagious disease or some other genetic issues that might endanger the future of the children physically or otherwise. This is something which is more contemporary, and many medical tests could be quite helpful in that, just to make sure that everything is clear from the very beginning. Now, we spoke about the beginning of the forming of the family in terms of criteria, but now the major topic for this halaqah, inshallah, is the engagement, ahkam al-khitbah, engagement, rules of engagement. Again, I'm using that in the benign, peaceful sense, not engagement, rule of engagement in fighting. They shouldn't be. And we're trying to answer 7 or 8 questions to clarify this. The first question: what exactly is the Shara'i or juridical meaning of engagement? In a way, engagement, okay, again, we speak about man engaging, but it should also be, it goes both ways. That when a man expresses his desire to marry a particular woman, and the acceptance on the part of that woman or her guardian and her guardian cannot give approval without her approval. So, but sometimes just it's a medium in some cultures. The acceptance here is not marriage in itself. It's very important. Engagement is not marriage. It is nothing more than a promise of marriage. Okay, that's one. Secondly, are there particular regulations about those that one is not supposed to engage them? Yes, there are cases like that. For example, if a woman is or has already been engaged by another person, then it is not right to go again and ask for her hand knowingly. Okay? What is the evidence for that? Is a sound hadith in Muslim and also in Ahmad. The Prophet ﷺ teaches the decency in dealing with other believers. He says a believer is a brother of a believer. You can say sister also in case a woman. It is not permissible to him, I mean to a brother, to try to buy something that his brother already had a contract to buy it. In other words, a brother, for example, bought a particular house and agreement was made already, but the contract has not been finalized, okay, or the procedure. So somebody goes to the owner of that house and try to offer him more money, for example, so that he almost like snatches that house from his brother. So that again is not a good action. But by the same token, he said a person or a believer should not ask for a hand of a woman that his brother engaged it. Does that mean forever? No, unless the first one, his brother who engaged that woman first, concluded that it is not fit for him or he's not fit for her or whatever other reason. So that means if that engagement is annulled, then of course any other person can go and seek her hand. A third question: when is there any time where you're not supposed to engage a woman? The answer is that engaging a woman is permissible at any time, but there are some exceptions for that. One, the case of a woman who has been divorced by her husband, but she's still in the waiting period. Just to clarify that issue, and inshallah in the future we'll speak in greater depth about the various forms of marriage dissolution, the divorce that is revocable and the divorce that's not revocable. But let's simplify things at that stage here. At this point, I'm just trying to clarify the issue. When a husband, for example, utters divorce to his wife, says, "I divorce you," for example, it is counted as one divorce. However, there is a waiting period, you can call it maybe cooling off period, where he can annul his divorce. During that period, which is in most cases in revocable divorce, for example, it is equivalent of approximately 3 months. There are other conditions, we're not getting into that detail. Approximately for 3 months, divorce does not become effective. In other words, it's uttered, but does not take effect except at the end of that, let's say, 3-month waiting period. What happens in these 3 months, and why they can be called legitimately and like cooling off period? Because maybe he might discover that he hastened to divorce, that this is not good for the family, not good for him and his children, or whatever other reason. So during these 3 months, he has the right to revoke his divorce. He can do that. And then divorce becomes effective. So if a woman is already still in that waiting period or cool-off period, it is not permissible that another man come to engage her because she's still connected with her husband, even though divorce did not become effective. I hope that that's clear. So only for that. But after let's say the third month, then in that case, divorce becomes effective, and a woman is free to remarry, and anyone is free also to seek her hand. There is also another exception. A woman who is observing a waiting period following the death of her husband. According to the Quran, that waiting period is a little longer, 4 أشهر وعشرة, 4 months and 10 days. It is probably longer in observation of the feeling and sentiments of the family of her husband, her in-laws, and of course to allow a period of mourning of the deceased husband. Allah knows best, but that's what the Quran determined. It's a longer waiting period. Again, a woman during this period, which again 4 months and 10 days, cannot be engaged. It is not right for someone to go and say, I seek your hand, or I want to marry you. There is a third observation to be complete, that if a person divorces his wife while she's pregnant, the ruling here is that the waiting period should not be just the 3 months like a woman who's not pregnant. The iddah, or waiting period for her before she can remarry or before divorce take effect, is only when she gives birth to the baby, which means it could extend close to 9 months. 9-month waiting period, and the husband would be fully responsible to support her for this almost 9 months, depending on the stage of gestation or pregnancy. Once she gives birth to the baby, now she can be engaged. And subhanallah, just a humble reflection. Why is that? Why 9 months? She's pregnant anyway. And of course, it's impossible within the teaching of Islam that she marry someone else and get some confusion in terms of lineage. My humble understanding of this is that they might be at each other's throat. During pregnancy, still nothing is resolved. But once the baby is born, it may, once you see a live, beautiful baby, boy or girl, it may perhaps push both sides to try to make up and resolve their problems. So there is that possible hikmah also behind that. I hope we covered enough of that when it is restricted, that you cannot engage a woman. I must say something also here rather quickly, that there is also permissibility in some cases of a person not offering to marry a woman who is going through this waiting periods, depending on the case, but to use what is called in Arabic ta'arid, not tasrih. Doesn't tell her, I want to marry you after the end of your waiting period or mourning. It's not proper. But they say ta'arid is to, for example, say, I am praying and hoping that Allah will help me find a pious woman to marry. And I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will send you some good in the future. Yani some sort of not direct request, but sort of hint that he might be interested in her once the restricting period is over. So much for that. The fourth question: is it permissible for the man, let's say, and apply to women as well, to look at the woman he is engaging or asking for her hand? The answer: I don't know of any evidence in the Quran and Sunnah that this right to look at your future spouse is restricted only to men. Women also have every right to see the one who's engaging her. And quite frankly, I cannot help but relate a real story. When I was doing graduate work at Indiana University in the 60s, and one brother comes to me, no names, no country of origin or anything, it's material. But you know, according to his riwayah, he said, the first time I saw my wife was after the walima. That's when she moved to his household. The first time to see her was when marriage was finished, walima is over, and she's with him in his household. I mentioned that for only one reason: to make a clear distinction between some overly strict or overly loose cultural practices of some Muslims that sometimes go against Sharia as laws and guidance, and against the spirit of Sharia when we take the total picture together. Apparently, it might have been a big shame in the mind of a highly conservative family that you could see the wife even that he's engaging. Maybe he engaged her because of reputation of the family or good things that he heard about that woman. But that's amazing. If that is for him, that means also she probably never saw him either. But this is not something in the past. We're not talking about the 60s. Right here in Halifax, I had a case, sometimes without determining the time frame. I have been here since 1970, so nobody can point out which case was. That some people came from a culture whereby, in order to allow the person who asked the hand of their daughter, and they agreed that he would not talk to her, they would not call each other, for example, on the phone or anything of that nature, unless he signs the marital contract. And they think that this is, perhaps consciously or not, that this is khutbah, this is engagement. No. Engagement is a promise of marriage. Signing a contract of marriage and meeting the requirement is marriage, not engagement. It is marriage. And that caused them lots of problems. Sometimes they're not aware of the laws in their particular country. For example, here in Canada, you're not allowed to marry people unless you have license. There are a few people who have a license as marriage officer, and especially with the stricter regulation today with the recent amendment to the Marriage Act. So the one who conducts marriage must have a certificate to officiate marriages. Secondly, nobody, imam or rabbi or priest or anyone, can marry a couple without the couple getting marriage license. For example, in our province, it's called Access, Nova Scotia. You have to apply for a marriage license and give all the details or the information that they request. You take these documents after you fill the parts that you should be able to find, like data about husband and wife and their parents and all of that. and you go to your imam or whatever other person who have the license to marry you. Once that marriage is signed, it is marriage, irrespective of whether there would be walima or not, or how long it will take before she moves to his household. But legally speaking, they're married. Now, if, Allah forbid, that after you sign the contract, something happened that what they thought engagement, but it is a legal marriage, what they thought was engagement only, and they want to go their parts, their ways, no marriage. They think that it's simple, okay, it's only a piece of paper, and then now she's free to marry someone else. This is illegal, because there are also laws regulating divorce in almost all Western countries, really, in a way, but I'm speaking about something we know intimately here in Canada, and specifically, for example, in Nova Scotia. But this is quite common within Canada, that the two parties, because they're married officially, even though there was no consummation of marriage, but they're married legally, they would have to live apart for at least 1 year. Maybe some jurisdiction might vary that, but a year is a common waiting period. And then sign an affidavit that they have been living apart, not together, for a year. And then go to court, because nobody can divorce you. The one who married you cannot divorce you. The law does not allow legal divorce, not shari, legal divorce, except through the courts of law. You have to go to the family law and apply and wait in line in the queue until your turn has come. So I'm just cautioning anyone from doing that or thinking that it is just an engagement. It is legal marriage with all of the consequences, even in case a problem may arise. So, alaq, قد بلغت اللهم فاشهد. Oh Allah, I've communicated. And I would urge any imam or marriage officer, if he feels or have indication that the family of the girl, for example, think that this is engagement and it's okay if it doesn't work. No, it is legal marriage. All right. طيب. Going back to the people who saw his wife for the first time too late in the game, that raises a question here. Is it permissible to man or either side to look at the other? Now we go not to culture, but to the way the Sunnah is. The words of the Prophet ﷺ as narrated in Bukhari and Nasa'i and Ahmad, the translation. The Prophet ﷺ said, if one of you engage a woman, there is no blame on him. It's okay for him to look at her. If he's looking to her without her knowledge, without even her knowledge, okay? And in fact, Jabir ibn Abdullah narrated also that the Prophet ﷺ said that if one of you engage a woman, if he could look at what urges him or motivates him to marry her, let him do it. That one hadith is in Abu Dawud and Ahmad. So Jabir, the narrator of the hadith, adds, he said, I also engaged a woman, and I used to hide myself, I don't know, behind a tree or what. I used to hide myself, mean to look at her. So I saw her enough that motivated me or made me desirous to marry her, and I did marry her. So even, I'm not saying that anyone can abuse that, and he says, oh, I'm really choosing, so we keep hiding behind trees and walls, looking at this and looking at that. No, this was فَخَطَبْتُهَا. He said, I engaged her. So still during the period, he tried to, find out more about her character, or attraction even to him as a person. People, like they say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So there's no problem with that. The Prophet ﷺ also was approached by another companion by the name of Al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah. He told the Prophet ﷺ, Ya Rasulullah, O Prophet of Allah, I want to get married to a woman. So the Prophet ﷺ asked him, did you look at her? Did you see her? He said, no. The Prophet ﷺ said, Unzur ilayha, look at her, see her. Because this is something that may bring sort of wifaq or compatibility between you. That was narrated in more than one hadith reference, An-Nasa'i and At-Tirmidhi. But the question here, which is the fifth question, what is permissible to see? The great majority of the jurists say that once there was agreement on the acceptance, we said engagement, an expression that you want to marry, for example, your daughter, and the daughter or her guardian, based on her approval, also say, we accept it, but not marriage really, it's promise of marriage. That we're in the process of exploring that you're good enough, or she's good enough in a way that there is good potential for marriage. The great majority of jurists, based on the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, are of the opinion that he is only allowed to see her in her Islamic attire, but more particularly, he is allowed to see her face and hands. Some jurists, this is not in the hadith, some jurists say that this is enough, the part that is permissible to women in any case, except for those who believe that covering the face is a requirement, which is a weaker opinion, but it's there, should be respected. But the great majority of scholars, and even Sheikh Albani, one of the great Salafi scholars of hadith, proved in his book Hijab al-Mar'a al-Muslima that the covering of the face is not a requirement, and he discussed the other view. But it's not getting into that. But in other words, the great majority of jurists say that it is permissible for a woman who is observing all the requirement of her Islamic dress to have her hands and her face bared. Even in Hajj, actually, a woman should not cover her face during the whole period of Hajj. So some scholars say that looking at the face, of course, can show the beauty, and beauty is not haram. I mean, you don't. It is part, and when the Prophet ﷺ, by the way, said that a woman is sought in marriage because of her beauty or wealth or nobility, it doesn't mean that these are all bad criteria and only religiosity. A woman is sought for religiosity in terms of hierarchy, order of importance. But if there is beauty also and other things, then like the Egyptians say, زيادة الخير خيرين. If you have something good and you have another something good, all right, it becomes two goods. It's not a sort of choosing on the basis of one single criterion or the other. So they say the face shows her beauty, and beauty, by the way, is not just physical beauty. You can get the sense of inner beauty as well when you see people for that purpose. And they say the hand, looking at the hand, which is permissible, because it shows khusuba. In other words, it shows fertility, for example, that might be shown. Oh, anyway, this is an opinion of a jurist that I read for, but it is basically that limit. Some jurists, but minority, said he can see more, but more here, of course, still within the proper hijab, like her shape. It is, of course, permissible only in the case of serious engagement, because as the Prophet ﷺ say, something that would make you desirous to marry that woman, which include so many aspects. So even in her hijab, they say they can look beyond the face and the hand. Question 6 of 8. What are the consequences of engagement in terms of the interaction between the two, who engaged one another? Again, emphasizing what was said earlier, engagement is not Sharia marriage. It is not yet. It is actually a promise to marry. A promise to marry. Subject, of course, to ascertaining through the period of engagement that there is no barrier or reason why you should not continue to the marriage. And because they're not married yet, and we'll talk about the marriage rules and conditions later, inshallah, it is not permissible to them to be in total privacy with one another. And unfortunately, on this matter, you find people go into one extreme or the other. There is one extreme that you heard already, that he sees her just like once, even if it's permitted, in some cases, even not. See her just once and say, oh, that's enough, and then no communication until marriage takes place. And to go to the other extreme, people say, all right, they are engaged, so they can go together, travel the world together. And this is totally loose. If some cultures in the West or East are doing that, we're talking here the word of truth, not to satisfy or appease one or the other. It is haram. And the evidence is right in the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I'll say it in Arabic also so that it will be clear. It applies to the case of marriage, engagement, and even dealing with the other gender who are not mahrams for us. لا يخلون أحدكم بامرأة ليس معها ذو محرم فإن ثالثهما الشيطان. Don't let any one of you, meaning here man, have total privacy with a woman who does not have with her mahram. Dhu mahram are people that are totally forbidden to get married to, like ascendants. We'll talk about that later. Ascendants like, parents, father, mother, وَإِنْ عَلَوْا, or grandfather and so on, grandmother. Descendants or siblings, because these are people who are forever forbidden to marry one another. Because if you do without a third person, then shaitan will be their third. But in the meantime, what is khalwa really? We need to also be clear on that. Some scholars say that khalwa is a place where the man and woman who are not married to one another, who are not close relatives like mother, daughter, sister, in a place where they are safe from anyone entering on them. Let's put it more clearly so there will be no confusion. Somebody visiting somebody else in his apartment or her apartment without anybody else there, that is fatal. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best about our human nature. And that's why it says shaitan will be the third of them. Any khalwa like this, the shaitan would enter. And that would affect, of course, the reputation of both sides. And if, Allah forbids, something took place and then the girl gets pregnant and then the engagement doesn't materialize into marriage, it's messy. It is messy. But on the other hand, there is this wasatiyya of Islam also without ma'siyah. And the question I raised with many scholars, and I found the answer quite reasonable. that if, for example, a number of people, males and females, are attending a given lesson, hopefully both observe modesty and lowering of gaze, but they're sitting in a wide area like this masjid, for example. And I'll give you an example that happened with me and happened with many imams. A sister comes to the imam or a brother or whatever. I say, can I ask you a private question? Private question. She doesn't want to ask in public, maybe. It's so embarrassing. Now, is it really khalwa or privacy to move, that the two move to one corner in front in the sight of everybody, maybe dozens of people, even a few would be enough, and then they can talk privately in the matter that she's inquiring about. By the same token, people who have already been engaged and people know that they are engaged, if again there is good reason to talk about something in the sight of everybody, but not necessarily hearing everything that they are talking about. So this is again an issue of avoiding to go to one extreme or the other, because one of the purposes of the period of engagement is to get to know one another, to think about your future plans and so on. And that requires that just looking at her once and okay, see you after 6 months when we make the wedding, official wedding. But obviously, of course, such things or contacts must be within the adab, the etiquette of Islam. And again, to bring a contemporary issue when everybody has, almost everybody except some of the older people who are not used to that, have a cell phone, and you can communicate with one another, sometimes even with Skype. If the adab of Islam, the moral aspect of Islam, and this is left to them. You can't appoint policemen on people's conscience. We can say also that there is no harm if the niyyah, the intention within the adab is to understand one another, especially if the people who got engaged are temporarily living in two different places or even countries, and just they want to keep contact and inquire about each other's. So again, that is an aspect that may not necessarily be shameful or should be avoided. The 7th question: is it permissible in Islam to annul your engagement or to go back on your engagement? Most scholars are quite clear on this, that based on the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, more than one hadith, that one of the signs of hypocrisy is when you promise something but you go back on your promise. That hadith, of course, or these hadith are general because it speaks about nifaq, like someone who hides something, promises something, and he knows he is not going to fulfill it. Of course, engagement is different to some degree because it is the engagement period is very crucial in determining the future of the couple. It's a serious matter. So in a way, as some scholars say, it's highly discouraged. Highly discouraged. It's not appropriate to go back on engagement without a very strong reason or knowledge or information that was not available to you at the time of engagement. Not just because it is presumed that when you engage a woman, or when a woman, by the way, like Khadija radiallahu anha, or offer to marry the Prophet ﷺ, and after Islam there were cases also when a woman initiate even the desire to marry a man. It happened. Some people think this is off and only in very loose societies. It's not. Both have the right to engage or to express that desire to marry. But of course, it has to be done in an appropriate way, preferably through parents, so that it doesn't become a matter of raising issue on the integrity of one side or the other. So generally it shouldn't. But on the other hand, as jurists also say, that if a person, for example, discovered that his knowledge about the other spouse was not complete, and that applied to man or woman, that they're not as religious or observant of their minimum religious duties as the person thought, discover something in their character or whatever other, if there is really a compelling reason to go back on that, then it is permissible, but it is otherwise discouraged. The final question on engagement. If during that period of engagement, one side or the other gave gifts to the other, normally it's usually, but not exclusively, the man who gives gift to the woman he engaged. Is it permissible if he goes back on engagement and knowledge to demand the return of the gift? Well, generally speaking, we have to distinguish, because that might get mixed up in the mind of some. If the husband-to-be gave a valuable gift to his future wife, hopefully, in advance, he doesn't have to do it during engagement. It could be done at the time of writing the contract or even afterward. But suppose he says, all right, I get you this beautiful piece of jewelry, but consider that a part, an advance part of mahr or marital gift when we negotiate marriage. In that case, it would have a different ruling because they were not married. It was a contract that's not binding, it's just a sort of promise. So in that case, perhaps returning it would be the more honorable thing to do. However, we find many jurists who said also that if the gift, they made distinction, if it is not intended as part of the future marital gift or mahr, but that thing was something that was consumed, like food, like a piece of cloth, for example, that was worn, or something that you gave and got lost. In that case, there's no obligation, for example, on the wife-to-be or previously wife-to-be to return it. There's no really sense of returning. The Hanafi jurists, however, were quoted as saying that if that gift is still there and it like having some value, not jewelry as part of mahr, just gift, free gift, then it would be more appropriate for her to return, because the assumption there at the time was that it may be worth it because this marriage might materialize after all. That brings us to the marital contract. What are the conditions? Are conditions all the same, or do they have hierarchy as well? I think it would be perhaps appropriate to stop here, because we try to make this halaqah as best as possible, no longer than an hour, but I can adjust a little bit back and forth in terms of the integrity of the topic. So instead of starting a very important and major area of the marital contract, and also some of the issues in our contemporary society and our experience here, even in the West, there are many, many important areas to look into. So it is 6 minutes before the hour, so you You give me a rain check for some other time, 6 minutes? No, I don't. Okay, I said maximum 1 hour. And I apologize, last segment of this, which was 2 weeks ago, because unfortunately I wasn't available. Last Friday I was in Britain for lectures. I was looking at the clock, and when it was getting close to 7 o'clock, I was confused. I thought it should end at 7. Actually, it should 7:30 because we start at 6:30. So my apology for that oversight on my part. We'll see you, inshallah. Hopefully next week I may have to make an advanced taping. No, inshallah, it's 2nd of August. Inshallah, we'll try to arrange for taping in advance because of another trip in leaving on the 2nd of August at night. So if there is a chance of taping it before taking the midnight flight, inshallah we'll do. But inshallah we'll try to make arrangement to keep the continuity. And please send your reaction or questions or comments. You're free to send it through the Ummah Masjid or to my email, which is jamalbadawi1 at gmail. The spelling is JAMALBADAWI, and this number 1, Jamal Badawan. It's all one word at gmail.com. Until then, if Allah gives us life, نستودعكم الله, leave you in the care of Allah. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.